The ammonia scent of the glass cleaner was the only thing keeping Maya awake. It bit at the back of her throat, a sharp chemical punctuation in the otherwise dead air of the 47th floor. Midnight had come and gone. The city below was a silent, glittering circuit board, and she was a ghost haunting its glass towers. Her cart, with its rattling bottles and gray, slumped rags, was her only companion. Exhaustion was a physical weight, a heavy coat she couldn't take off, pressing down on her shoulders and blurring the edges of the polished mahogany desks and chrome chair legs. This was the penthouse suite of Quan Holdings, a place so quiet and expensive it felt like a tomb. A very clean tomb. She pushed the cart forward, the squeak of a wheel a desecration of the silence. Her instructions were simple. Clean the main offices, the conference room, the executive washrooms. Do not, under any circumstances, enter the frosted glass door at the end of the hall-marked private archives. Tonight, the fatigue made her reckless. The door was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm, low light spilled onto the cool marble floor, an invitation. She told herself it was a security risk. She told herself she was just checking. She pushed her cart to the side, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound, and slipped inside. The room smelled different. Not of citrus polish and recycled air, but of old paper and cedar and something else, something metallic and clean like cold steel. It wasn't an office. It was a museum. Glass cases stood like soldiers in the dim light, each housing an artifact. Pottery, jewelry, weapons. And in the center, on a black velvet pedestal, was a scroll. It was ancient, the paper the color of weak tea, brittle at the edges. The calligraphy was elegant, a dance of black ink on a fragile stage. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, a soft melody from a childhood spent in a home filled with stories of a place she'd never been. This is the old language, little one. The language of kings and poets. She hadn't heard it, spoken it in years. But she could read it. The characters were as familiar as the lines on her own hand. Without thinking, her lips formed the sounds, a whisper lost in the climate-controlled air. It was a poem, a map, a riddle. A story of a silver moon and a sleeping dragon. She didn't hear him enter. One moment she was alone with the ghosts of the past, the next a shadow fell over the glass case. A man stood behind her, so still he seemed carved from the same obsidian that made up the display stands. He was tall, dressed in a suit so black it drank the light, tailored so perfectly it seemed a part of his skin. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, his black hair threaded with faint, surprising lines of silver at the temples. He wasn't watching the scroll. He was watching her. She straightened up fast, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. The cleaner's uniform, the light blue dress and white apron, suddenly felt like a costume for a fool. "I'm sorry," she said, the words catching in her throat. The door was open. "I was just securing it," he said nothing. His silence was an object, a heavy thing that filled the space between them, pressing the air from her lungs. His eyes, dark and intelligent, held hers. They weren't angry. They were analytical, curious. It was somehow worse than anger. He was taking her apart piece by piece with that quiet, unnerving gaze. "What did you say?" he asked. His voice was low, a velvet rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floor. It held no accent she could place, just a kind of deep, resonant control. I didn't say anything, a stupid lie." He had to have heard her. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture of almost predatory patience. "You were reading," he stated. It wasn't a question. "My scholars, men who have dedicated their lives to this period, say this dialect is indecipherable. A dead branch of the language tree. Yet a cleaner in the middle of the night reads it aloud." He took a step closer. The air grew colder. He smelled of expensive cologne and something else. Something dangerous. "Tell me again what you said." This was it. This was how she got fired. Maybe arrested. Cleaning the offices of a powerful man like Jin-Woo Kwon, the notorious Korean mafia boss whose name was only ever whispered among the building staff, came with rules. And rule number 1 was to be invisible. She had just broken it in the most spectacular way possible. But the exhaustion, the sheer bone-deep weariness of her life, had burned away the part of her that knew how to be properly afraid. "It's a poem," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "about finding the dragon's tear. It gives directions. By landmark and starlight. It's a map." From Jin-Woo Kwan's perspective, the world was a chessboard of assets and threats, all moving in predictable patterns. He valued control above all else. Control of his empire, his emotions, his environment. The archives were his sanctum, a quiet monument to the history and power that defined him. He came here when the city's noise became too much, to stand in the silence and remember the weight of his legacy. And into this controlled, silent space, this anomaly had appeared. A young woman in a pale blue cleaning dress, her hair pulled back in a simple knot, whispering a language no one living was supposed to understand. He had watched her for a full minute before he spoke, fascinated by the contrast. The mundane uniform against the priceless artifact. The tired slope of her shoulders and the focused intensity in her eyes. The soft, fluent murmur of ancient Korean from the mouth of a 25-year-old African-American woman. It was impossible. A glitch in his perfectly ordered reality. When she turned, he saw not the fear he expected, the fear he was accustomed to seeing in everyone who looked at him, but a flicker of defiance in her wide, brown eyes. She was startled, yes, but not broken by his presence. She stood her ground. He was the head of the Chongryong clan, the Blue Dragon Syndicate. Men who commanded armies of lawyers and killers alike deferred to him. Yet this girl, whose name he did not know, whose hands were probably chapped from bleach and hard work, met his gaze and lied to his face. And then, when pressed, she told him the truth with a simple, unadorned clarity that cut through the layers of deceit he dealt with daily. "It's a map." His own translators, flown in from Seoul at exorbitant expense, had produced nothing but academic theories and excuses. They had called the script a ceremonial fabrication, beautiful but meaningless. He had been told the scroll was a symbol of his family's lost history, not a key to it. And this girl, this cleaner, had unlocked it in a whisper. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice deliberately soft. "Maya," she answered. No last name offered. "Maya," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He looked from her face to the scroll and back again. The dragon's tear. A legend. A myth his grandfather used to tell him. A diamond of impossible size and purity, lost for 3 generations. He had always believed it was a story to teach him about loss. Now, it seemed it was a treasure hunt. And the only person with the map was the night cleaner. "You will no longer be cleaning my floors," Jin-Woo Kwan said, the decision forming with cold, swift certainty. "Your employment has changed. You will work for me directly. You will translate this." Every word. The next 24 hours were a blur. Maya went from scrubbing toilets to sitting in a leather chair so soft it felt like it was trying to absorb her. She had been escorted from the 47th floor, not out the service exit, but down the private elevator that opened directly into a subterranean parking garage. A black car with windows like polished night waited for her. No one had asked if she agreed to this. The mafia boss, Jin-Woo Kwan, hadn't made a request. He had issued a decree. Now she was in his home, a penthouse that made the office look like a waiting room. The walls were glass, offering a panoramic view of a city that suddenly felt like it belonged to him. A copy of the scroll, a perfect high-resolution photograph, was laid out on a glass table in front of her. Her old life, with its cracked linoleum and radiator that hissed all winter, felt a million miles away. She was given clothes, simple black trousers and a silk blouse, and food that tasted like nothing she had ever eaten. But it was all a cage, just a much more beautiful one. Jin-Woo sat across from her, watching. He rarely spoke. He would just sit for hours, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, his gaze fixed on her as she worked. The silence was unnerving, a constant, low-grade hum of pressure. He was a man made of stillness and shadow. Her friend Lena's voice echoed in her mind from their frantic phone call earlier. "Maya, you listen to me. A man like that, he doesn't hire you. He owns you. You get out. You run, but how could she run? Where would she go? They knew her name, her address. Besides, a part of her, the reckless, exhausted part, was morbidly curious. What was it like to be this close to so much power? What did a man who had everything fear? She focused on the text, the familiar characters a shield against his unnerving presence. The second star sleeps behind the weeping stone, she murmured, translating aloud as she worked. The path is guarded by the river that flows uphill. What does that mean? Jinwoo's voice startled her. I don't know, she said honestly, looking up. It's poetry. A riddle. It's not a modern map, he considered this, his expression unreadable. Then we will solve it, the "we" hung in the air between them. It was the first time he had included her in his world with a single word. It felt less like an invitation and more like a chain, linking her to him, to this penthouse, to this impossible, dangerous task. Jinwoo found himself observing her with an intensity that was inefficient, illogical. He should have sequestered her in a room with a document and a guard, extracting the information he needed with clinical detachment. That was the smart play. That was what the head of the Chongryong clan would do. But he didn't. He kept her here, in his personal space, where he could see her. He watched the way she chewed on her lip when a passage was difficult, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He noticed the smudge of ink on her thumb. These details were irrelevant to his goal, finding the dragon's tear, yet his mind catalogued them obsessively. He was a man surrounded by people who wanted something from him. His wealth, his power, his protection. They approached him with carefully constructed masks of respect and fear. Maya had no mask. She looked at him not as a mafia boss, but as an obstacle, an employer, an irritatingly quiet roommate. She argued with him about the meaning of a particular character. She complained that the lighting in the room gave her a headache. She treated him like an ordinary man.
It was terrifying, and it was intoxicating.
One evening, he found her asleep at the table, her head pillowed on her arms, the photographic scroll spread beneath her. Her face, stripped of its waking tension, looked impossibly young. A wave of something protective, something fiercely possessive, washed over him. It was an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. It was a liability. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder, his intention to wake her. But he stopped. He couldn't bring himself to break the peace that had settled over her features. Instead, he took the cashmere throw from the back of his chair and gently draped it over her. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, but didn't wake. He stood there for a long time, watching her breathe in the silence of his gilded cage, and felt the carefully constructed walls of his world begin to crack. This woman was not a tool. She was not an asset. She was a complication of the most dangerous kind, and for the first time in his life, Jinwoo Quan did not care. A week bled into 2. The city outside the glass walls could have been on another planet. Maya's world had shrunk to the size of the penthouse, to the space between her and the silent man who was her captor and her employer. The translation was nearly complete, the riddles coalescing into a set of tangible instructions pointing to a place, a building, right here in the city. An old art gallery, long since abandoned, owned by a shell corporation that traced back, unsurprisingly, to Quan Holdings. As the mystery of the scroll faded, it was replaced by the mystery of the man himself. One night, a storm broke over the city, rain lashing against the windows. The power flickered and died, plunging the penthouse into a disorienting darkness, lit only by the frantic, strobing flashes of lightning. Maya jumped, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her. A moment later, a beam of light cut through the dark. It was Jinwoo, holding a small, powerful flashlight. He wasn't looking around at the darkened room. He was looking directly at her, his face half lit, half in shadow. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said, her voice a little shaky. Just surprised, he walked over and set the flashlight on the table, angling it so it cast a soft, indirect glow. Then he sat, not in his usual chair across from her, but in the one next to her. The sudden proximity was electric. She could smell the clean, crisp scent of his shirt, feel the warmth radiating from him. When I was a boy, he said, his voice quiet, almost confessional, I was afraid of the dark. My father told me that fear was a weakness our enemies would exploit. He would lock me in a cellar for hours to cure me. Maya turned to look at him. In the flickering light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. She saw not the powerful Korean mafia boss, but the ghost of a lonely, frightened boy. Did it work? She asked softly. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the rain. No, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I just learned to be afraid of my father instead. It was the first piece of himself he had ever offered her, a shard of his broken past. Without thinking, she reached out, and her hand rested on his for a single, fleeting moment. His skin was cool, his stillness absolute. But under her touch, she felt a tremor, a subtle, deep vibration, like the fault line in the earth just before it breaks. The translation was finished. The location was clear, a sub-basement in the long-defunct gallery, accessible only through a service tunnel whose entrance was hidden behind a fake wall in a boiler room. The dragon's tear was within reach. But their work had not gone unnoticed. Jin-woo's world was filled with listening ears and watchful eyes. His rivals, the heads of the other syndicates, knew he was looking for something. They didn't know what, but they knew it was valuable, and that was enough. The day they were set to go to the gallery, Jin-woo's head of security, a grim-faced man named Min, delivered the news. There's been a breach, sir. The Huang family. They know about the gallery. Jin-woo's face hardened. The brief softness Maya had glimpsed vanishing as if it had never been. He became the man she'd first seen in the archives, a figure of cold, absolute authority. They don't know about the tunnel, he said. It was a statement of fact. But they will be watching the building. We can't go in the front. His plan was simple and insane. There was an old service entrance in an alley 2 blocks away, one that connected to the building's maintenance corridors. But it was exposed. Getting from the car to that door would be a risk. You will stay here, he said to Maya, his tone leaving no room for argument. This is my business. No, she said, surprising herself as much as him. The scroll is full of architectural riddles. The door that is not a door. The stairs that descend to the sky. You need me to read the signs inside. She saw the conflict in his eyes. The strategist in him, the mafia boss, knew she was right. But the man, the one who had confessed his fears in the dark, wanted to keep her safe. It's too dangerous, he said, his voice tight. So is being your prisoner, she countered, her heart pounding. At least this way. I'm a participant. The look he gave her was one of frustrated admiration. He knew she had him trapped. He gave a sharp, reluctant nod. The ride to the gallery was silent and tense. The black sedan moved through the city's streets like a shark. When they pulled into the alley, 2 other cars materialized, boxing them in. The attack was swift, brutal, and professional. Doors flew open. Men in dark suits with guns. The world erupted in a symphony of shouting and shattering glass. The next few seconds were a chaotic nightmare. Min was shouting orders in Korean. Jin-woo moved with a speed that was terrifying. He grabbed Maya, shoving her down onto the floor of the car, his body covering hers like a shield. The car rocked as something heavy slammed against it. The percussive pop-pop-pop of gunfire was deafeningly close. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, her face pressed against the plush floor mat, the smell of leather and gunpowder filling her senses. Jin-woo's weight was immense, a solid, living wall between her and the violence outside. She could feel the tension in every muscle of his body, the controlled power he held in reserve. This was his world. Not the quiet penthouse and ancient scrolls, but this. Sudden, brutal violence in a rain-slicked alley. The fight was over as quickly as it began. A final gunshot, then an aching silence broken only by the sound of the rain and Jin-woo's harsh breathing. He didn't move for a long moment. She could feel his heart hammering against his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched her own. Is it? She started to ask. It's done, he said, his voice strained. He pushed himself off her, moving to look out the shattered window. We're clear, he turned back to her. There was a dark stain spreading on the sleeve of his white shirt, high on his shoulder. A deep, impossible red. You're hurt, she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," he said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand, but she saw him wince. The mask was back in place, but it was cracked, showing the pain and vulnerability beneath. He had shielded her, taken a bullet that might have been meant for her. The professional arrangement, the pretense of employer and employee, was gone, destroyed in a hail of gunfire. What was left was something raw and terrifyingly real. He had protected her, not as an asset, not as a translator, but as someone he valued more than his own safety. In the back of that dark car, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, she saw the truth of him. The monster, the mafia boss, the lonely boy, the man who had just bled for her. And she was no longer curious. She was afraid. Not of him, but for him. And for the part of herself that was inextricably tangled up with him now. They never made it to the gallery that night. They went to a private clinic run by a doctor with no last name, who asked no questions. Maya sat in the sterile white waiting room, listening to the muffled sounds of Jinwoo's wound being treated. The spot of blood on his shirt had seemed so small, but the reality of it, the fact that his body had been broken open, felt enormous. She looked down at her own hands. They were steady. The panic had receded, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. When he finally emerged, his arm was in a sling, his black suit jacket replaced by a loose-fitting dark sweater. He looked pale, exhausted, but his eyes were clear, and they found her immediately across the room. He walked over and sat beside her, the space between them charged with everything that had not been said. "You should have left me at the penthouse," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Yes," he agreed. His voice was rough. That would have been the logical thing to do. He turned slightly, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I am not a logical man where you are concerned." Maya, there it was. A confession, stripped of all poetry and pretense. The truth laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was the most controlled man she had ever met, a man who ruled a criminal empire through sheer force of will, and she had somehow become his singular weakness. His chaos. "Why?" she asked, the word barely a breath. "Why me?" He was silent for a long time, studying her face, as if he were trying to memorize it. "Because you're the first person in a very long time who has looked at me and has not tried to calculate my value," he said. "You look at me and you see a man. You are the only one who does." The vulnerability in his voice was devastating. He was offering her the most honest, broken part of himself. The part he had learned to hide in a cellar as a child. A choice stood before her, clear as glass. She could take the out he would surely give her. He would send her away with enough money to disappear, to start a new life, to forget she ever read an ancient scroll in a private archive. Or she could stay. She could step into his world of violence and shadows, a world that had already hurt him, a world that would almost certainly try to hurt her. She thought of her old life, the exhaustion, the invisibility, the endless cycle of cleaning up other people's messes. It was safe, yes, but it was a half-life. With him, she was seen. With him, she was a participant. It was dangerous, it was terrifying, but it was real. She finally looked up, meeting his intense, waiting gaze. "The dragon's tear," she said, her voice finding its strength. "Is it real?" Jinwoo seemed to understand her unspoken question. She wasn't asking about the diamond.
She was asking about them.
About what this was all for. "I don't know," he answered with raw honesty. "It was my grandfather's story. A way to find something beautiful that was lost." He reached out with his good hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, questioning. Perhaps the scroll was never about a jewel. Maya leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was an answer in itself. A commitment. The choice was made. The penthouse, the scroll, the rival gangs, the legendary diamond. They were all just part of the absurd, terrifying and beautiful story of how she met him. The heirloom wasn't the goal anymore. It was just the path that had led them here, to this quiet moment in a sterile room. Two impossibly different people finding a fragile, dangerous hope in one another. "Okay," she whispered, her hand coming up to cover his. "Let's go find it." Together, his fingers tightened around hers, a silent promise. Outside, the city glittered, oblivious. It was a world of threats and assets, of predators and prey. But in here, for now, they were just a man and a woman, and the beginning of a story that was far from over. The future was a blank page, and the language they would write it in was one they would have to create themselves.